Okay, well, welcome. My name is Bill Connor. I am the Director of Institutional Advancement at Hughes Hall, and I'm welcoming you all here to our Senior Spotlight event. And I'm very pleased to welcome my old friend, Ruhul Abdin, who is joining us from Dhaka this evening. But before we start, just some housekeeping matters. We're asking you all to stay on mute. You should know that the event is being recorded. We are also trialing a Zoom closed caption service for the first time. So you will see a CC button on the bottom of your screen. If you wish to follow the conversation with the text, you can have it as a subtitle at the bottom, or it'll run on the side of your screen if you'd like to watch that. We're seeing how this works. So it's an experiment. So you can choose to join it or not as you like. We're scheduled for an hour. We will close promptly at 6 o'clock London time, Cambridge time, unless Ruhul and I run out of things to say, or you all run out of questions. We will play that by ear as we get nearer the end. If you have questions you'd like to put to us, please put them in the chat, and I will try and moderate the questions as they come in, and we'll hopefully have some good discussion at that point. And lastly, to let you all, the next Senior Spotlight event will be with Caroline Trotter, who's a fellow of the college, and she will be talking about Cambridge, Africa, and somebody will put the link to that event, which is to take place on the 11th of March. So now that all the housekeeping is over, let me say welcome again to everybody, especially to Ruhul, who is past his bedtime already. So it's wonderful to have him with us at this time of night in Dhaka time. I think we'd like to start by just talking a little bit about how I became aware of Ruhul's interest in queer space making. Some years ago, Ruhul was doing a project in Croydon where he established a queer space, had a marvelous event where he brought together a number of people from a number of communities. And perhaps this is a good place to ask my first question, Ruhul. Tell us about queer spaces. Why queer spaces? And maybe specifically, why a queer space in Croydon?
Good afternoon, good evening, and probably good morning to some of you out there. Thank you, Bill and Hughes Hall, for inviting me. I'm just trying to find out where I am in all these images. It's really cool to see so many different faces. Why queer spaces? I think it's a very, very big question and also a very important question. And I think just in my own experience, between here in Dhaka and in London, the way queer people feel safe to be able to be themselves is a challenge, actually. And I think creating those spaces is also very difficult in megacities like London and Dhaka, where space is scarce, but it's also expensive. So I think finding ways to navigate those very, very expensive cities and finding spaces for communities where, in Croydon specifically, when we did that event, we talked about queer people of color and minority communities within the queer community not having access or not being able to access spaces. I think it's just that, really, and beyond that, just all the work that I've done working within urban space making and placemaking informs a lot of the way I've been thinking about how a place can genuinely be made.
I was very taken in Croydon at the different communities you brought together. Not only were you successful in bringing together a lot of the young marginalized people who are from different ethnic groups, different age groups, and have different gender identities, but you also had the city councillors from Croydon, and you had the old white boys like me who have been active in gay rights for many years. I remember Stonewall was only about 2 weeks after I graduated from high school. So there is there's a merging of different communities and what they can do. So tell us how that worked together and how you brought them all together. We've lost Ruhul. There he is.
I'd sort of I think one of the from work that I've been doing is just be able to shout. So, and one of the things in Croydon that's been very also had strong LGBT representation. There were people that I'd met in gallery about these concerns, and that also encouraged this kind of, and they also connected me with some of the older members of the community who were around and who wanted to engage with a younger dynamic community as well. So I think it was just having sort of an urban city kind of council space where, because there were queer allies within the council, it made it much, much easier for that conversation to take place in that space than I think if there was not. And I think representation then, whether it's having LGBTQ representation within Croydon Council at different senior level positions, or within the community in Croydon itself, that I think made a big difference. But having said that, there was still a grievance from the younger population, as you saw and heard, about the lack of access and so affordable spaces for individual or younger members. And I think that's something that I think maybe is going to be an ongoing conversation for Croydon to keep on doing, and I think they will keep on doing. But I mean, I just moved to Croydon, I think the year before the exhibitions. I think it was interesting to be able to, for myself, to navigate this sort of the city council, friends that I'd made, and young artists that I'd sort of got to know, and then inviting other friends from outside of Croydon, like yourself and other friends who'd come to also then participate in these conversations. Yeah.
And any outcomes from this conversation? It was a great evening, a great crowd, lots of interesting questions, people from parts of the community that I have very little contact with in the course of my life. What came next? What difference did you manage to make?
I think it was very difficult for me because I'm between two places. One of the things that I've learned is you've got to genuinely be rooted in one place for a considerable amount of time to begin to make genuine inroads. I think there has to be genuine long-term visions of 10, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years sometimes. And I think pre-lockdown, I think there was conversations to try and get to a point where we would take over a space or understand how to collaborate on a space in Croydon. But since then, I've just been in Dhaka. So I think that, and I suppose now we have a very different reality of what a genuine physical space is. But having said that, the people that I had met have gone on and continued to do the various activities. Croydon has quite a colorful pride, and it's very well attended, and it became very, very big and successful. And I think that will only go from strength to strength with some of the people that are in the council who are pushing it. And I think they are keen to push the diversity angle as well within the council. With whether that's very PC or not, I don't know, but at least they're trying from their own kind of perspective. But I think it's going to be difficult. I think it requires leadership, and I think that's something that maybe is something very difficult to for me to talk about, because I think when I talk about it from an urban space making, place making, urban planning leadership, I can talk about it from a strategic perspective. But I think a lot of young people are not coming from that point of reference. They're not coming from an education and training where they know how to navigate councils and renting spaces and places and organizing. And I think a lot of young people genuinely have, especially those that are in minority communities, have mental health issues, have financial issues, have other issues, have social, much other concerns to deal with on an everyday basis. That I think that within itself takes priority than to be able to think about creating space for others. So I think that's where the challenge is. I think I've been very lucky to be able to create some opportunity or conversations and sometimes some spaces either here or in the UK, for these events or activities to take place, or these conversations to take place. But I think, yes, someone has to be physically there and continue the, catalyzing, I guess. You got to be really in it, in the movement, or in the mobilizing, or in the procuring, or navigating and networking, as you very well know from your own kind of work. Once the networking stops, then it's quite likely things will fizzle down. So it's a case of just continuing on. So I think, when I come back, I'll be back in Croydon, and quite likely, we can have these conversations again once I'm back then. But it's very difficult to have these conversations far away.
Let's then move our conversation to Dhaka, where you've been for the last year. And we have a short video to show everybody, which is called "It's Not My Body, It's Their Eyes," and it sets the tone for a lot of the issues you've been dealing with in the year you've been locked down in Dhaka. So have a look at this short, everybody.
Okay, I'm going to see if this works. How do I do this? Okay, 1 second. Give me a second. Just give me a second. I think I can do this. I'll just give a bit of context on the video whilst I'm trying to find it again. So this is a video we just shot from our studio a couple of weeks back. Nibir, my fellow queer colleague, was in charge of it, directing and shooting, and it's a campaign that we've just started within the studio in connection to a fashion kind of project within the studio as well. Give me 1 second. I think I'm going to be able to do this. And it's just 2 minutes long, so it's not too long. Here we go. It's going to work. Is that working?
We have a screen share is working. We haven't seen the video yet.
Okay. Is the sound okay though?
Yep, got it.
It doesn't matter what you're wearing. Male gaze, it's not new to me. যখন like teenage থেকে সব মেয়েরা experience করে, which is not something you should experience in এত early age experience করা উচিত না।
নর্মালি হচ্ছে আমরা ওমেনরা অলওয়েজ যখন রোড সাইডে যে অনেক ভিকটিম হই, দ্য ওয়ে দে স্টেয়ার অ্যাট আস।
সাধারণত একটা মেয়ের জন্য তো পুরোপুরি এখনো কঠিন, যেখানে একজন ট্রান্সজেন্ডার হিসেবে যদি সেখানে কথা বলতে চাই সেটা তো আরো কঠিন।
বাস্তব জীবনে আমার নিজের অভিজ্ঞতার কথা যদি বলি, যে আমি একদিন একটা জামা পরে এবং জিন্স প্যান্ট পরে আমি একটা লোকাল বাসে যাচ্ছিলাম। আমার উপর কী পরিমাণ যে সেক্সুয়াল হ্যারাসমেন্ট শিকার হতে হয়েছে সে বাসে, সেটা আমি বলে কেউ বলতে পারবো না। কেউ আমার মানে যেই জায়গাগুলি অস্পষ্ট জায়গাগুলিতে তারা স্পর্শ করতে চায়, অপ্রত্যাশিত জায়গাগুলি তারা ধরতে চায় সেরকম, এবং কোনো কোনো জায়গায় তারা টাচ করেছে, আমার ব্যাক সাইডে তারা হাত দিয়ে টাচ করেছে, জোরে চাপ দিয়েছে। সেই বিষয়গুলি আসলে তখনকার সময় বা এখনকার দিনেও আমাদের মতো মেয়েরা আসলে প্রতিবাদটা করতে পারি না, কারণ ওখানে অনেক পুরুষ মানুষ থাকে।
আসলে এটা তো ঠিক না, কখনোই ঠিক না যে গন্ডারের সামনা করতে হবে, সইতে হবে। আসলে আমাদের সিস্টেম বা আমার যে জেনারেশন সেখানে হয়তো বা আমারকে অভ্যস্ত হতে হচ্ছে। ফর নেক্সট জেনারেশন যেটা হচ্ছে কি আমাদের এখানে কাজ করা উচিত, যে স্টেরিওটা ভাঙা উচিত, শুধুমাত্র কোনো নির্দিষ্ট কমিউনিটির জন্য না, সবার জন্য।
আসলে মেন্টাল স্ট্রেংথের উপর ডিপেন্ড করে। প্রথমে আসলে আমি কোন স্ট্রাগল পিরিয়ডটা নিজে ফেস করছি, এরপরে হচ্ছে আমি আসলে কিভাবে ওটার অ্যাপ্রোচটা নেব।
When we can understand what is on their mind, and this actually affects all of our self-confidence. এগুলা জিনিস আমি কান দিই না, এগুলো যার মতোই আমি আমার মতো করে যাই।
We have dealt with our size and body, with everything. We are always dealing with it. If I'm confident with my body, with my shape, with my everything, people will get used to over this. This is something I deeply believe in.
It's them, it's not me. It's not my body, it's their eyes.
Thanks for that, Rahul. I think this sets the stage very nicely for the next things I'd like to talk about. We live in a very privileged world in the UK, Europe, America. The progress of gay rights, LGBT rights has been extraordinary. And some of the most telling experiences have been the referenda in Ireland, for example, a few years back, or Australia, where more than 2/3 of the population accept the notion of gay marriage, same-sex marriage, and rights available to LGBTQ people. When you move to Bangladesh, it's a very different story, and the need for queer spaces and opportunities for people to be safe and to meet others like themselves is a very different proposition. I don't know, Rahul, would you like to say a few words about the differences, which are vast, or would you like to go to your presentation and start with that?
I think why don't I think it's just yeah, I think the difference is obviously definitely between London and Dhaka is beyond kind of a short kind of summation. So maybe it's easier to sort of explain through some of the projects. Obviously, once we've already touched on Croydon and we've touched a little bit on the videos. So I think if I continue in the slides, then I can talk a little bit more about Dhaka and the way we've done stuff here, and also provide some more context. Is that okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, let me, oh God, how do I do this again? These things. Okay. Nice.
It's working.
Can you see everything? I'm assuming yes.
Yep, it's all here.
Is that okay? Okay,
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really cool. And I think I also just, as I was sort of thinking about it a little bit, I found this particular drawing that I did whilst I was in Cambridge, considering, you know, I'm talking to an audience from Hughes Hall, and also across the world. This particular drawing was of a quartet of Drew's viola siblings that came to Cambridge in 2014 on the invite of Amnesty, who protested against conscription in Israel. And this was sort of a really important, for me at that moment, it was a really important drawing, and also talks about how potentially artists, musicians who are protesting have done so. And just this setting in Cambridge is quite a useful drawing, but it's not related to London or Dhaka specifically, but it does relate to the wider ways of protesting and also perhaps using art to protest. Let me see. And I think I tend to want to also just sort of put forward some very simple ideas of, you know, where I am in terms of my own vulnerabilities. And, you know, I know you very well, Bill, and we have this kind of diverse, eclectic audience, which is great. But, you know, we talk a lot about safe space, and especially in our studio work, we talk a lot about safe space. But considering over the last year, there's been a lot of work that's been online, you know, and I imagine there'll be lots of scholarship in the future about how safe online is. And at least for this particular conversation, you know, I feel relatively safe, and I'm okay with presenting most of the things that I'm going to present. But even then, I'm still careful about what I can and cannot show in terms of images or photographs from the various events that I've done, or even the art that I've made. So I think there is always going to be a key understanding of that in terms of understanding what my specific vulnerabilities are and how that relates to the kind of way that I talk about some of the work that I do. And just a slight overview in terms of this particular conversation. I'm going to focus on the artist, the curator, and the organizer of my hat. And I'll touch a little bit on some of the architectural work that we do between London and Dhaka. And as you sort of suggested, but in terms of some context for where Bangladesh is and what Bangladesh is currently, it was established in 1971 through a civil war with Pakistan. Currently, there is a large population of 160 million people, and I'm in the megacity, in the capital, which has more than 20 million people, or roughly around 20 million people. in the wider context of queer, kind of recent queer history related to Bangladesh in 2014, there was recognition of a third gender by the Bangladeshi government, which isn't very clear still, and there's lots of problems with it. I won't go into details on that in this particular presentation, but others, if you have any questions, I can definitely maybe answer some questions later on. Along with that, there was a group that organized themselves under Rupban, and they held a few rainbow rallies in 2014 and 15. And in 2016, the police actually had warned against another rally taking place. And at the same time, there was sadly the murder of two kind of prominent activists at the time, Sulhas and Tonoy, which I think left the community here and still in quite a vulnerable kind of traumatic space. And I think that's something that will take a few more years to really unravel itself or heal. And just recently, we've had the passing of the Digital Security Act in 2018. But having said that, at the same time, in a small town called Shatkhira, we've just had the first transgender councillor elected. And this is just in January, so this is very recent news. And there are various groups that do exist within here who are formal NGOs and informal organizations. I won't mention names at this point, but they have been very active and supporting each other in various ways, both throughout the COVID and also previously. And sort of the backdrop to a lot of that is the Digital Security Act, but also the ongoing kind of uncertainty in the way arrests are made and disappearances take place and beyond that. And so we talked a little bit about Dhaka, and I wanted to touch a little bit about the railway station and this project that I did over a couple of years at the railway station, which isn't specifically queer related, but touches on the way I approach people and communities, and the way I feel the artist in me can contribute to the way society evolves and develops. So these were a series of large on-site drawings over 2-3 years, over a couple of weekends. And it was mostly drawings and portraits of children and women by the railway station, most of whom used to hang around at the station. Some would live on the kind of platforms, some live nearby. And it was just a very, very powerful point for me to reflect over that period. I'm just reflecting on again now, the biggest challenge was at the time and still is, to not be poking and asking questions about who they are and where they're coming from and why they're here. And I think this idea of just giving someone space to be themselves, even in this half an hour, 40-minute drawing time, I think was a very, very powerful moment, just for me, perhaps not for them. And there were times I think that I would leave the station quite overwhelmed by kind of the energy that was invested, or kind of the love that I felt, or the love that was expressed in the drawings or from the people in terms of their appreciation of it, just as a continuation conversation. But coming back to being queer in the city, Bill, do prompt me if I'm speaking too much or if you need me to hurry up at the same time.
Anytime, keep
Sure.
going.
So yeah, so I think being queer in the city, I think, is just very, very difficult, especially from the perspective of Dhaka. Unless you're someone who's visible as a trans woman or part of the Hijra community, perhaps you're an effeminate man or a masculine appearing woman or a trans man. And I think appearance in terms of the video and what we talked about in terms of, I feel Dhaka is a very, very, very heavily male dominant city. Everywhere you go, it's just men, men are everywhere, and they occupy the streets, they occupy the markets, they occupy the restaurants, they occupy, the trade, the offices, everywhere you go. In contradiction to perhaps garment factories specifically, which have a majority of women working in them. But outside of that space, there's just this weird kind of patriarchal domination of men who use the city as they want. I was talking about the station, and right outside the station, there's a bathhouse where men are bathing, in broad daylight throughout the whole day, and you can just see them doing whatever they're doing. There's a perversion there, but there's also this kind of men don't care kind of attitude in the streets. Whereas I think if there were women attempting, or people were attempting to bathe in that uproar, perhaps there would be much more shock. This idea that men can do whatever and almost get away with it, especially straight men, is very, very problematic for Dhaka city. And just flipping back to what we talked about right at the beginning in terms of Croydon, and beginning to make Croydon also a home, and this conversation of exhibiting some of the works that I was developing and doing. And I think that was, for me, one of the most challenging projects that I did in terms of the reclined nude scrolls. It was a very personal project. It was very much about me and my friends, and then presenting that to a public, and then having a conversation about some of those issues, and inviting the public to come see it, made me feel vulnerable, I think, in a way that I think I hadn't felt before. I think, I can just about get away being a cis gay man, mostly. But I think this was the first time where I was putting my work out there in a way that revealed my sexual identity versus my other identities. And I think, but it was a very powerful thing to do as a Bangladeshi person in Croydon. And then I think I thought it important to continue that project. So I'll come in on that a few slides later. And at the same time, between Famida, myself, Famida who's in the room as well, in this room as well, they and I and a few others had organized the first kind of queer Bengali night in London, and specifically in Tower Hamlets in Bethnal Green, where the concentration of the British Bangladeshi population are. And this is a performance artist, dance artist, Ruqayya, who performed on the first night, in the second night, but and it was a really, really important kind of moment for us to kind of reflect on as well. And I think, Famida and myself have continued Oddbud and its activities currently online, but we're going to come back with some more activities in the future in London. But I think organizing something in London felt much, much more, especially in Tower Hamlets. At the time when we were organizing, we were questioned about the idea of, why are we doing it in Tower Hamlets? How dare we do it? It's going to put all of us at risk. And why don't we think about the risks involved and, the fundamental sect of the community that might be more Islamist leaning or extreme leaning might be very offended that we're doing this in Bethnal Green. So, there was a lot of fear involved in organizing this event. And I think it was very overwhelming and amazing to do it, as a small group of people, and inviting other queer identifying Bengalis and allies of ours to be present. And I think just hearing some younger, not that I'm old, but hearing some younger queer Bengalis or Bangladeshis talk about the fact that A, they had not heard Bengali music in a queer space, and B, that like-minded queer Bengalis were in that space, made us realize, again, going very back to the very idea of, why do we need to create and spaces and places for, diverse queer communities? And I think it goes back, way back to the 50s and 60s when it was happening everywhere else in very different circumstances. But I think this helped us to really understand the importance of safe spaces and how to get access to them and how to use them to support our own community to it, in terms of specifically the Bengali community. And, and we've used the event to support artists and also promote activities and activism that are happening in Bangladesh at the time as well. And I'll take a small breather. And so this was an event that we'd organized in 2019 here in Dhaka, and I'd mentioned, 2016 was when Zulhas and Tonoy were murdered brutally. And since then, there were not any activities taking place in actual public venues. There are a couple of events that took place in private spaces, in expat clubs that are safe and secure. So this was actually a group of us organized this event. And as I was talking about kind of the safety and security concerns, I've sort of had to just blur out all the faces. Just, you never know where these images might go, but just to sort of protect the community here. But also, it was a very powerful event to do here, and helped us again to understand why it's important to re-engage with community organizing and finding spaces. So this was in a mutual friend restaurant near where I live and where we're based. And it was very interesting and powerful for this straight ally to give us access to the space, but also for them to support the project. And we had more than 100 people attend this particular event. And we continued on. Just before lockdown, we did one more event, another smaller event in a similar space. And just talking about organizing, we just finished organizing something in January or February 2021, sort of this year. And COVID has a very different kind of way of being seen here. But I think this event, however, was taking place in a safe space, in a secure kind of expat space, where there was controlled security and controlled entry. And also, although there were other issues related to even these kind of spaces, it was interesting to be able to continue doing these things again, or restart doing these things again. And just touching on representation and drawings, this was a project that I started during lockdown, and it was a series of video calls, basically video portraits that I did from April to about July of queer Bengali men or queer identifying Bengali men, mostly in Bangladesh and also elsewhere. As an important step, I think, to just understanding that actually Bangladeshi queers are not represented in this media, in this kind of space of nude life drawings. And I thought it important to focus on the brown bodies, the different bodies that exist. And although I've not expanded it onto other queer bodies, it was important to kind of explore this conversation through these drawings. And there were very, very important conversations that were had with over maybe 30 to 40 different queer men, talking about vulnerabilities, about securities, about safeties, and specifically about mental health. Mental health came forward a lot of the times in a lot of my conversations about, the fact that people don't feel safe online, offline, in this city, in going to places. And I think that's really, really difficult. And so that brings me sort of in a roundabout way to this idea of, how do we then continue to make cities safer for the queer communities? And how do we how can we queer the city in some ways? And how can we create spaces where queer people can be present without feeling threatened? A fundamental question comes out to, whose city is it? And I think I mentioned right at the beginning, Dhaka itself is such a male, straight male dominated city that I think almost everybody else feels like this city is not for them. But whereas I think London, or pockets of London and small pockets of London, there is beautiful diversity and there is beautiful queer spaces that are accessible to some of us. And I think, the way that Londoners and people in the UK have been able to fight for some of those rights and occupy some of those spaces, and then own and use those spaces to support queer artists or just the queer community in general, has been quite for me, a very important kind of learning point and a reflection point. So I think, how do the queers in Bangladesh begin to think about occupying the city and spaces in different ways? I think, we have to be we just have to be very, very tactical, very underground, but also very subversive and not so in your face. But those are things that I think we can maybe explore in depth in questions. But I think from a planning perspective, we need to have more collaborations in the process and how various neighborhoods are made. And, in terms of the scales of the problem, as I was saying earlier, there's lots of intimate household kind of events, irrespective of class, maybe, sometimes, not always, access to kind of community space that are, I can host hypothetically, I can host an event for some friends, or others can host a small gathering for friends, and there's no kind of genuine threat there. But when it becomes an urban event or a community event that's visible, then I think there are problems there that need to be genuinely challenged through, legal protocols, but also through community organizing and activism work that's happening already on the ground.
Rahul, if I could interrupt just for quickly a question, because I think what I'm hearing from you is there's a great deal of danger in all of this, and fear and bravery required to do some of the things you're doing. And I remember vividly when the two lads were murdered in 2016, how upset you were and how afraid you were personally. And I've observed in the 4 years since that happened that you've now been in Dhaka for the longest period I recall since I've known you, that you're stepping out in new ways. But again, this speaks to these safe space issues, and you're talking about safe space being private spaces mostly, being under the cover of darkness, if you will, or out of sight of the general world. But will it ever break out of that? And again, I go back to Stonewall. A bunch of drag queens took on the police, and that was quite a brave thing to do in 1969. Would a bunch of LGBTQ identifying Bangladeshis ever take on the system? Is that time here yet?
I mean, I don't know is the answer, but I know it will happen. That's for sure. I think with the way technology has advanced, with the way we have so much more access to the way other communities elsewhere are organizing, mobilizing, and setting precedents. For example, India and its own kind of journey of repealing Section 377, and how much do we learn from those kind of actions? I think there, with any of these things, that we have to create the environment, or we have to find a way to create the environment for these things to happen. And I don't know when it will happen, but I imagine it will happen. I don't know if I'm perhaps not the right person to comment on it either, considering my own privilege of being a British citizen and able to, perhaps escape if something does happen relatively aggressively. So I'm also very careful to not overstep my own kind of abilities or capacities, and and sort of do megaphone kind of shouting online or offline and say to people they should do X or Y. I think, and that's perhaps why I think Famida and I and others have thought, we need to do what we can in the UK for the British Bangla community, and support that process, which in itself is a very different and distinct kind of situation. And also, you know, as much as we can, support the community here in different ways. And I think, as I was saying, you know, for me, I think it's been mostly subversive and being relatively under the radar, but also not, but also being, as I set the scene right at the beginning, you know, what Dhaka or what Bangladesh's problem is that we have a couple of laws that have made it very, very difficult for people to say anything to begin with. And anything that begins to challenge authority in a genuinely, you know, legal way or without real evidence can put lives at risk. And I think, you know, so we found other ways to continue the conversation. I think this is the thing that's important, I think. And there's a lot of work happening currently in Bangladesh with the mainstreaming of the transgender community, which I think is very visible now. And during lockdown, we'd seen a lot of groups of NGOs and non-governmental organizations and charities and international organizations like the UN and others be very involved in supporting the trans community during the lockdown, with money, with other security support, with food. So I think there is a consciousness building that's taking place here, that is happening. And so an example that I wanted to give was just through sort of the studio work in terms of what Para has been doing, you know, over the last couple of years. This is sort of a really, I think, sort of a very small but a powerful kind of moment for us, where we created this big bamboo installation with the Lido children's community. It's a homeless kind of orphanage just on the outskirts of Dhaka, not too far away. And it was meant to be and designed with architecture students, but also with students that we were working with, to be an inclusive space for children with disabilities, but also for anybody to do anything in. And during the opening, what we had done was we had invited a queer arts group to do a series of performances. And so in this image, you can see an artist with sort of the young gentleman with the box with a face on it. That's the face of Tonoy. So he was distributed, and he was dressed as a unicorn at the time, but also he's got a rainbow tail. And this is, you know, in a very open space with his children, and he was distributing these beautiful kind of portraits of both Zulhaz and Tonoy to the audience. You know, it wasn't sort of loud, it wasn't very provocative, but it was just the fact that this action was able to take place was, I think, a very powerful moment for us when we opened the space itself. And within that, there were others who, you know, are queer performance artists, who are dancers, and they were able to also perform. And I think there's this, for us as a studio, we were able to talk about that a lot. And within the studio, we're very mindful that, you know, vulnerabilities come across a spectrum of diverse kind of needs from different people. So whether they're queer, whether they're, you know, whether the person has disabilities, whether they have mental health issues, whether they're coming from different class backgrounds, we're continuously questioning our own kind of approach to how we work in the studio. And that also informs a lot of the way I work personally. So I think just to end on this slide, I think then we can go into questions or further comments, is, you know, I've talked a little bit about the diverse projects I've done over the years. But just this year coming and going on and going forward, we're just in the process of developing an arts lab near our studio, which is going to be very much about working with the neighborhood and also inviting in a diverse community of artists, you know, many of whom will be queer. And we want to support that in that process. But it will be focusing on working with the immediate neighborhood. And we've been working with a large low-income community in terms of urban growing and working with kind of young people there. And finally, there's two things that I think touch on, and then a project that the video that I'd shown you is part of our fashion project that we've launched called Chol, where we want to push some of the boundaries of designing, where we think about what social values of fashion are, where we want to talk about sustainability and the ethics of fashion representation. And, you know, so we've invited models who are queer, who are of different body shapes, and we want to celebrate both the queer bodies, the trans bodies, and body positivity in general, but also beyond that to go on, as you saw in the video, to talk about these things in the wider public as well. And finally, I think what we talked about in terms of the subversive dimensions of it, I'm the lead visual artist to a small kind of project with the National Portrait Gallery in Tower Hamlets, with Tower Hamlets Libraries and Archives, where I'm working with sort of 12 to 15 citizen researchers who are researching the role of British Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets in the liberation of Bangladesh in 1971. What's an interesting reflection on that for me is that I pitched it as a queer artists project, and within the researchers there were also maybe 2 or 3 other queer identifying individuals. And as I talked to some of the researchers, what was really powerful for me was that in that conversation with the other researchers was that they said, oh, we're so happy that a queer artist is leading this kind of project, but also that there's potential then for us to think about how we can include the queer narrative in the celebration of 50 years of Bangladesh. And I think that's important. I think going right back at the beginning, what I talked about in Croydon, you know, this idea of being a leader within being visible, being represented, or not forcing the representation, but definitely encouraging additional representation is important. And just on a side note, we've just taken over a small space in Tower Hamlets from my other hat, which is I'm part of another collective called Oitidjo, and Aher Anjum, who's just going to be giving a talk in about 20 minutes or so as well, on a different platform, has been working super hard over the last year or so to get access to this space in Tower Hamlets. And of course, from my kind of hat as a queer artist, I will be using that space, and we will be using that space to support and promote queer activities for the Bengali community in that space as well. So this was a visual, if people, those people who know the idea still. I'm going to stop.
Yes, no, this has been great, but I thought before we take questions, and we're running close to our time, I'd like to ask a few questions about your own story, because I think it too is interesting. I know you as a cosmopolitan, well-educated British Bangladeshi, great fun to spend time with, a great host when I visited you in Dhaka and showed me some fabulous and things that I would never see otherwise. But I think you've also described your background as very traditional. Your family moved here when you were a small child. You are still very much in touch with your family and relatives in Bangladesh. How is it being, you know, the queer member of the family, and how is your journey with them impacted your life and some of your work in queer space and being a queer artist and so forth?
I think it's been very difficult. I've been lucky. I think there are just 2 points in short. I think I've been very lucky to have a kind of family that I've created outside of my, you know, my blood Bengali family. But also I think I've just been very brash about it. You know, I've just said, you know, take it as it is or not. And I've had to draw some of those lines quite aggressively. My older sister, who's been very homophobic, I've had to draw a very, very harsh line with her. You know, and despite, you know, I've lived with her in London for many years. I've raised my nephews with her, and, you know, so there's a very strong connection there with the family, but then I've had to draw that line, which has taken, you know, a considerable amount of time to get over. And recently, actually, I think I was rebuilding some of those relationships, but we've again come to a kind of halt. So currently, I'm not speak to the family because I thought, being accused of the reason why another sibling couldn't get married to a boy, just whilst I'm 13 months into my adventures in Bangladesh, being told that because I'm gay, my sister can't get a husband and it's my fault, was just too much to take, I think, at the time. And so I'm currently not talking to them. I've sort of said to them again, you really need to make a decision about whether you accept it or don't. So it's been difficult, I think. Although I want to, I think at the same time, I'm not, I'm just mindful that I don't want to continue hurting myself in this kind of cycle,
It seems to me
Yeah.
making an amazing difference as a role model, a thinker, an activist, and some of the marvelous things you're doing. But I'm also aware of time, and we are now 6 minutes short of the time when they're going to pull the plug on this presentation. So I think we'll try and take some questions. So, are there any questions? I don't see anything in the chat room yet. So I'm looking in the wrong place. No folks here with some interesting questions. Urgent issues.
There are questions, Bill, in chat.
I can't find them. Why am I not finding them? My chat says it's empty. Can you see
I'll
them?
just read it out. Martin's question was just, how is the word? Yeah, I see it. Yeah. So Martin's question is about how the word queer is addressed both in Bangladesh, but also amongst British Bangladeshis. There's resistance and opposition in the UK in general about the word. So I wondered how different it might be amongst Bengalis. I'm not so sure yet. I think there's obviously a progressive generation. People here in Bangladesh are using it to navigate doing activities here, partially because it's a word that isn't on the radar of the government. It isn't on the radar of kind of security issues. So the word queer isn't, it doesn't mean anything to anybody other than queers, perhaps. So some people are able to use that word to navigate here. And it's a very new word in Bangladesh. Perhaps in the last couple of years, it's only been used. Whereas I think those MSM, in terms of men seeking men or whatever, those kind of terms that various INGOs had sort of popularized back then. But yeah, and in the UK, I don't know. I think queer, within the younger Bangladeshis, I think it's fine. Maybe in the older, I'm not so sure. There's lots of closeted gay men. So I don't know how they will feel about that particular word, for example.
There's a question here about schools. What recommendations do you have for opening up spaces, conversations in schools?
Specifically, is there a specific in terms of which schools, what type of schools, or what age of schools? I think there's, if it's, for example, in town hamlets, I think there's a friend who goes to various schools and does, I think, the diversity role model platform, I think, that does school outreach work that I know of. So I think there's one or two Bengalis that participate in that specifically. But I think also there are, there is literature. There is literature that's available. There's videos that are available. There are things that can be presented specifically from a Bengali perspective to these schools. And I think there was a group that made a comic, a comic strip for young lesbians, I think, or something like that. But I think we need to have content for schools. I think age-appropriate content, and I think we've seen within the way the Birmingham kind of protests took place at Anderton Park 2 years back, and then kind of the the ongoing cases. Yeah, I think it's just very difficult. I think it's very difficult to know. I mean, fundamentally in the UK, it's going to be law to teach from this year, I guess, about at least gender and sexuality in a light way. But I think you can Google that and find out more about that.
There's also a question here about what is the legal position for queer people in Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think it was just a question before, I think, or I think you just messaged it to me, sorry. I talked about, sorry, so I'll do quickly both. I'll do Jodie's question.
Okay. Oh, you can see
the legal, I think the legal space is quite difficult. Yeah, the other question, I'll do the other question and maybe we've got 2 minutes I can see. So one question was, I talked about patriarchal country, yet they have approved a third gender law and have a governmental figure now in office. Would this point to an acceptance of transgender rather than gay or lesbian individuals? I think definitely yes. I think historically we have had a very visible Hijra community, people who have been involved as a community group, who are very visible, and I think they've been having their own kind of sets of campaigning to achieve that. I think in terms of the gay community or the lesbian individuals, I think for the lesbian community is very, very, very much still, I think it's very difficult for people to comprehend that lesbians exist in Bangladesh. And for a lot of gay men, I think it's just about the sex and not about anything else. So it's difficult, I think. So yeah, I think it's going to be difficult until we talk about those kind of practices. And then the second question, do you want to just quickly repeat it, Bill? I know we're going to be sort of quickly cut off at some point. I'll try and answer. So Jodie, in short, I think we're trying. We invite people we know, and people come on and dress up in the venue and then leave when they can. And I think that's been the challenge. I think we're very mindful that yeah, we created a safe space for security, but as soon as someone leaves that space, what happens? And that's something that we actually face more in Bethnal Green in Tower Hamlets than I think here in London thus far. So I think drag queens in Dhaka are not an estranged phenomena, perhaps thanks to the amazing work that the Hijra community have done over the years. So although there might be a labeling, it might not be perceived to be super violent. Whereas I think when we organized the first event in Bethnal Green, one of the queer Bengalis had left and then was quickly provoked and attacked, but I can't remember if that was by a fellow British Bengali or who that was provoked, but there was a security man outside who had supported the guest and made sure they got in the taxi and then left. We had tried to, I think there's a really good model with, I think the way, for example, Pussy Palace, for example, in the UK, in London, does events, and they do really reach out to the community and say, hey, we're going to make sure if you can't get a ride home, we'll make sure you get in a cab. If we can't get there, we'll make sure you get there. And I think those are some of the things that we've been trying to ensure as well. At least in the first event we did, we just made sure some of the people got an Uber home, and and we made sure that Uber was paid for, so they did get home securely and safely. So I think there are things that we can do. Not everybody does it, and I think, and for that reason, people also do not come to these events, and that's also a challenge, I think. Yeah, how do you get people to the event if they don't feel safe in the city? It's a very, very difficult quagmire.
When we look at the progress of the gay rights movement over the last 50 years, there's another 50 years ahead. And we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank Ruhul hugely for taking time to talk to us and tell us some of his story and some of his initiatives, and the notion of spreading the word and being inclusive and helping people who find it much more difficult than we do in London nowadays is a great story, and it's a great initiative. I think I've known you about 10 years now, Ruhul. I recall saying at the time, I hope I know you in 20 years' time. Well, I still hope there's another 20 years ahead. It's always interesting to talk to you, and it's always interesting to see what you're up to. And we look forward to welcoming you back to London as soon as that's possible. So thank you, everybody, for coming from Bangladesh. I see California here and a lot of folks in between. And it's been a very, very interesting hour. And thank you for joining us. And please come to the next Senior Spotlight on the 11th of March with Caroline Trotter. Anyway,
Thank
good
you,
night, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you
Bill,
for coming.
for
Bye-bye.
organizing this. Yeah.